Hello mga Ka-Journo! How are you? I hope you're all doing fine and staying safe wherever you are. I'm your one and only Maestro Journo, Maestro Journo Leo. Before we proceed, don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel, like and follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter for more video content on the life of a maestro who is also a journo and all those journalism lessons that you need to know. Mga Ka-Journo, let's talk about the news. When we mention the word news, what comes to your mind first? Well, before we're able to know what the news is all about, we have to understand it first. So understanding the news, meaning knowing the newsmakers, is foremost among the essentials in writing and reporting the news. So before you're able to write a really good and effective news story, you have to understand what you are writing or reporting about. So, what is news? When you are asked, ano ba ang balita? They say news is an acronym. The letters N, E, W, and S have their own meaning. What do you think do N, E, W, and S stand for? Yes, it's all about the primary directions. So N for north, E for east, W for west, and S for south. Now, what does that signify on the meaning of the word news? It only means that there's always something new happening everywhere in all directions. In other words, all those happenings cover all places. Now, among all those happenings, events, ideas, situations, what makes one a news story? Like anything that qualifies to be something, news has its own characteristics. First, a story should consist only of actual persons and events. Remember, do not ever invent details like names, numbers of people, places, and the event itself. Otherwise, it's not news you are writing. It's fiction. Second, for a story to be considered news, it has to primarily inform or explain. As a news reporter or news writer, it is your duty to tell the audience what happened and maybe explain a bit in a straightforward manner why something happened. News may also be uplifting, enlightening, instructive, or merely entertaining. And that is why news is not just about anything that happens in politics or in the government agencies, in the localities. We have news that has something to do with sports, lifestyle, entertainment, business. So anything that's currently happening that has to do with those aspects of life can be considered news as well. News does not take sides. Otherwise, it's not a news story that you are writing. You are writing an editorial piece or a column or a commentary. News often presents action without explaining the motivation. When we say motivation, it can be subjective. So something happened because of an action of a person who may not really want something to happen at all. And the news doesn't dig deeper into that. Again, the news tells the reader what happened and explain in a straightforward manner why something happened. News must be of interest to a number of people. If a story that you have in mind only interests, let's say, your neighbor, your best friend, your seatmate, and once you tell your story to other people and they don't even react at all, then maybe your story is not newsworthy. Again, it has to have an impact to a larger audience. News must be timely. They say news is perishable, like food, because if we don't consume the news immediately, it will be spoiled. It will be like food that is panis. So you have to report it at once you have all the information for your audience. News must be accurate. Details on names, numbers, locations, and all those important information that the audience need to know should be exact and not erroneous. Lastly, news must be concise and clear. So usually, news stories are short, but even so, they make the audience understand what they're reading about. In terms of publication of the news, it really depends on the newspaper. Not all newspapers are created equal. What fits in one paper may not fit in another. What may be considered news for one newspaper may not be considered news for the other. Or what may be considered a big story for this particular newspaper may not be seen or deemed as a big story for another newspaper. It usually depends on what readers want. Remember, journalism is also an enterprise. So there's a business aspect to it. So what the newspaper company deem as what will sell among its audience, they will consider it as news. And so that story gets published. Going back to our main question, what is news? We have to define the news. I have here an industry standard definition of news. For us media practitioners, we consider a story as news if it is a timely, factual report of events, ideas, and/or situations that are interesting or significant to the public, a wider audience. Take note of the words highlighted in red because these are the keywords to help you define the news. According to Tim Harrower, in his book Inside Reporting, there are several factors that make a story interesting to readers. And he lists 7 in his book. First, impact. It's something that has an effect to the audience. If the audience doesn't even react to the story, then maybe it's not interesting for the audience. There's immediacy, the urgency of an event to be reported. Remember, news is perishable. If it's not reported at the soonest possible time, it may no longer be news. Proximity pertains to the nearness of an event. For example, your newspaper is printed or gets published from Manila. So all events, happenings, ideas, situations that again are significant or interesting to the public that happens within or around Manila is always considered news because it is within the vicinity of the place of publication of a newspaper. Prominence refers to popularity. We have government officials, celebrities, scholars, and it's not only people who can be prominent, places can be prominent as well. Then we have novelty. It pertains to something new from the term novel, which means new. It may be a cultural phenomenon, a fad, but in terms of news, usually novelty stories are short-lived. We also have conflict, anything with opposing forces between the good and the bad, man and nature. Lastly, we have emotion, stories that pierces the heart of the audience. In Filipino, these are stories that have kurot sa puso. Aww. Now, can you think of actual stories or stories that saw publication or broadcast as examples for each of those 7 factors that make a story interesting to readers? Feel free to comment down below. These 7 factors that make a story interesting to readers are what we call elements of news, or another term is news values, the values of a story that make it news. In short, these are factors of newsworthiness. So we look at these factors and see if a story that we have in mind has one or more of these factors. Just having one of those factors makes the story newsworthy. Harrower may have listed down 7 news values, but wait, there's more. Those initial 7 factors are here. Other news values that we look at in the industry that were not mentioned by Harrower are the following. We have suspense. Just like those TV shows, dramas that we get to watch on television or maybe on our mobile phones, there's something to do with thrill. What is in that story that makes the audience want to know more? That gets them thrilled and excited about the developments in the story. Then we have disaster. Stories about natural phenomenon like weather disturbances. So we have typhoon, storms, we have earthquakes, volcanic eruption, and even man-made disasters like fires, accidents. Those are almost always considered news, and especially if there are casualties. Adventure has something to do with big endeavors of people like travel, conquests, breakthroughs. Now, what stories can you think of when we talk about romance in the news? Relationships of celebrities, weddings, that's romance in the news. Oddity refers to something unusual, something that tickles the imagination of the reader, that maybe it's the first time that they get to encounter that particular story. Occasion. So these are stories about observances, holidays like Valentine's Day, Mother's Day, Father's Day, Christmas, New Year, Lenten season, and all those special days that people get to celebrate or observe or commemorate. Number. The idea here is the bigger the number, the more newsworthy the story is. Number and disaster usually go together in terms of elements of news. Would you believe that animals make for news stories as well? An example of an animal story would be Mali, the elephant. Mali is considered the loneliest elephant in the world. And lastly, we have human interest, which again pertains to the emotions, things that pierces the heart of the audience. And usually, stories on human interest are stories of ordinary people. Those rags to riches stories, students who are able to finish their studies despite poverty, or a person with disability that has an advocacy. So anything that has a big impact on the reader that usually inspires or motivates them to do the same in life. In terms of industry practice, we look at those news values as part of our news judgment. These are our basis if something is newsworthy and worth publishing in the newspaper or airing on TV newscasts. So what we do is identify the most dominant element of the story. One story may just have one news value, but the fact that it has a news value means it is newsworthy. But there are also stories that have more than one news values, and all the more that they become newsworthy. Now, let's see an example of a published story in the Philippine Star. Can you identify the primary news value or element of news of this particular story? Do I hear prominence? Yes, that's right. This story mainly is banking on the prominence of the subject. The fact that the name of the president is first mentioned here means the editors judge the story based on the element of prominence. And we know that the president is the most popular, most powerful person in the land. So more or less, the audience knows who this person is. Now here's another example. What's the primary element or news value of this story? Conflict? Yes, because the word crisis is first mentioned in the first paragraph of the story. Then we can also see number, and it says there prices have soared to 70 pesos per kilogram, and it's pretty expensive already for rice as a commodity. Again, what is news? Charles Dana, New York Sun editor, says, when a dog bites a man, that is not news, but when a man bites a dog, that is news. Philip Graham, Washington Post publisher, says news is the first rough draft of history. For William Randolph Hearst, an American newspaper tycoon, news is anything that makes a reader say, gee whiz. For Lord Northcliffe, a British newspaper tycoon, news is what somebody somewhere wants to suppress. All the rest is advertising. Do you agree? Comment down below. Dana has another notion of news. For him, news is anything that will make people talk. And for Turner Catledge, New York Times editor, news is anything you can find out today that you didn't know before. And to reiterate our definition for this course, news is a timely, factual report of events, ideas, and or situations that are interesting or significant to the public. And again, this is an industry-accepted definition of news. Here I have a real-life example of that man bites dog news story. This is from the Associated Press. Let's read. Don't you find it interesting and amusing? What do you have to say? Feel free to comment down below. And so, as news writers or news reporters, what's your purpose of doing so? Why do you have to report the news? Why do you have to write about it? You are there to get the facts and to transmit, report, or relay these facts to your audience, whether it's a newspaper reader or TV newscast viewer. So as a news reporter or news writer, you've got to have the facts which you need to transmit, report, or relay to your audience. Otherwise, if there's no transmission, reportage, or relaying of these facts, then you are not really engaged in news writing. There has to be an audience as well. So remember those three elements: the facts, the act of transmission, and the audience as the receiver of those facts. But remember, the primary purpose of journalism, according to The Elements of Journalism, a book written by Bill Kovac and Tom Rosenstiel, is to provide citizens with the information they need to be free and self-governing. And so what does that have to do with the aim of news and news writing? Based on this purpose, we may have to tweak the aim of news and news writing a bit. It has something to do with immediacy, as we've talked about earlier. The audience has to get the information right at the moment they would be needing the information from you. With that comes the challenge in news reporting. What do you think is that challenge? It has something to do with time. Starts with a D. Yes, deadlines. And it's a sacred tenet of journalism. Remember, the industry lives by deadlines. Journalists, media people live by deadlines. Without deadlines, news will always be perishable. And according to todayifoundout.com, to have the latest news and still get a newspaper printed and distributed on time requires strict time limits for those who write it. So as budding journos, we all have to train ourselves to beat deadlines. Otherwise, you won't get any of your story published in the newspaper or aired on TV newscast. Even if we have to beat deadlines for our stories, however, we have to stick to the principles of journalism. Remember what our friends Kovac and Rosenstiel state in their book? What's the first principle of journalism? It has something to do with the truth. So don't forget that as journalists, it is your obligation to tell the truth to the public. Make sure that what you are doing is truthful reporting. Nothing more, nothing less. Second, you have to be loyal to citizens. Remember, in the movie The Post, Justice Hugo Black, who decided on the case of the New York Times versus the United States, opined that the press was to serve the governed, not the governors. Third, the essence of journalism is a discipline of verification. So as news reporters or news writers, it is your duty to verify the facts that you have gathered before your story gets published or broadcast. Let's zero in on the discipline of verification. So according to Kovac and Rosenstiel, there's no standardized code for verification. Verification is a method. There are several options or steps that we can follow in doing so. What could those be? First, we can seek multiple witnesses to an event. This is what we call multi-sourcing. Don't just rely on one source or subject for your story. The more, the better. Second, disclose as much as possible about sources. You may have sources, but are they legitimate sources? How do you tell that to the reader? The best way is to get background information about these sources and mention these background information in your story. Third and last, ask many sides for comments. And this has something to do with number one. So as you seek multiple witnesses, you ask for their sides or for their comments and mention these varying comments in your story so as to give your audience a better and wider perspective about what happened. In the end, the discipline of verification is what separates journalism from pure entertainment, propaganda, fiction, or art. When we say propaganda, it is selective of facts. Sometimes it invents facts to serve its real purposes. First is persuasion, second is manipulation. And these days, as we've been observing, these invented facts are being used to push propaganda. Ergo, the rampancy of fake news, which we have to avoid and fight to keep the true spirit of journalism alive. We also have to emphasize that journalism alone focuses on the process employed to get what happened downright. And what process are we talking about here? Simply put, we call it data gathering or news gathering. And we have to make sure that it is legitimate data gathering or news gathering because at the end of the day, we have to stick to the facts for us to be able to tell the truth to our audience. Which makes the discipline of verification the beating heart of credible journalism in the public interest. As budding journalists, and even yours truly, who's already in the practice of the profession, we should always gun for credibility for our news stories. Or else, we might have to deal with questionable outputs that could cost us our much coveted journalistic careers. Do you have questions, comments, or reactions, mga Ka-Journo? Feel free to comment down below. Thank you for watching, everyone, and I hope you learned a thing or two. Again, don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel, like and follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. That's Maestro Journo. For more journalism-related content like this, I'm your one and only Maestro Journo Leo. And till the next video lesson, bye-bye!